With all the handouts that I've given you, you're thinking I'm going to speak for a long time, but I'll try to keep it short. Some of the things I'd like to point out about the text that we are reading now in Exodus. Did you notice the number of times that it uses the word know, K-N-O-W, that the Lord knew, and the word remembered? For instance, in the second chapter that we read of Exodus, verses 25 and 26, which are at the bottom of page 1 of your handout. So God heard their groaning, and he remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And God saw the sons of Israel, and God took notice of them. The NASB says, and God took notice of them, but really what the Hebrew says is that God knew them. Here is where we first began to get that obvious truth in the scriptures, if we study them, that the word know, K-N-O-W, and the word to remember are covenant terms. When God is said to know about something, that's different than when it says that he knows someone. Right? So we remember that that word know is used in a covenant sense with regard to marriage. It says that the husband knew his wife, and she conceived and bore a son, right? So they're conspicuous here. The final phrase in the Hebrew is just two words, and God knew. The modern translations, and God took notice of them, is an attempt to interpret the word know, but it should be understood as a covenant term paired with remember with its meaning to be loyal to the covenant. And so God is faithful to his covenant. And by the way, the handout that I put out for the kids, I know there's been a lot of kids here, I anticipated Spike, and I did the handout on the flood. So if you have grandkids or if you have kids at home, you could take one. There's some coloring sheets and some other things to go over in terms of the flood. Well, the first act of the Egyptians noted in the book is that of the Pharaoh who rose, who did not know Joseph. Did that mean he never heard of Joseph? No. It means he made no promises to him. He made no pact with him like the former Pharaoh did. It means that Pharaoh was unwilling to maintain the covenant of the former pharaohs, which they had made with Joseph and his family. To not know Joseph does not mean he is unaware. Egyptians were big on history. If you ever studied Egyptian culture, ancient culture, it means that the current Pharaoh did not intend to honor the covenants made with Joseph and his family. Remember, the former pharaohs gave them the land of Goshen and so forth and so on. This sets the stage then for the whole book of Exodus. God, as Israel's husband, will demonstrate his faithfulness to the covenant and will redeem her at great cost. And that's why the Haftarah was added with this passage. Because the Haftarah basically says there's coming a time when they're going to crush all of their idols into dust and not have them anymore, and they're going to turn to the true God, the God of Israel. And then God will shower them with blessings. Yes?
Are there other examples in the scriptures of this type of to know?
Yes, throughout.
In a covenant sense.
In a covenant sense.
I haven't heard this before. When I've read that verse, it's always been to know. And he didn't have any clue about Joseph. But, like you said, the Egyptians leave landmarks.
Right. Well, there's plenty of evidence in non-biblical ancient covenants. I can show you some in the thesis that I did years ago for my master's thesis. Shubilu Lamash and Huganis. Huganis is his vassal. Shubilu Lamash is Hittite. And he says when he makes his covenant, and these covenants have been discovered in hieroglyphs and so forth, in stones that they have recovered archaeologically. He says to Huganis, you must know me. You must know no one else. Which means you have a covenant with me, you cannot have a covenant with anybody else. No other king. And so it's well established that the word know, yada, in the Hebrew and its equivalents in the Semitic languages was used in that sense. Not only in that sense, but it's used in that sense. And so when it says he did not know Joseph, it cannot mean he didn't know about him. Joseph had been part of the Pharaoh's, reigning. The previous reign, he worked for the Pharaoh. He was well known and well recognized as the one who saved the people for the Pharaoh because of his having kept it. So it's an impossibility that the next Pharaoh didn't know him. It means he did not have covenant with him. He was not willing to maintain what the previous Pharaoh had promised. Okay. So what is the first issue? It's babies. Where does the enemy always hit? He tries to take away what God considers most important. I see it in we talked about this last night a bit at our Shabbat table. What's the sign, as we brought up the flood, what was God's covenant sign of the flood? And today when you see somebody flying rainbow, wearing rainbow, or you see signs with rainbows on them, what's it about? Perversion. The enemy wants to take the very signs of the covenant that God has made with all of mankind, in this case, and change them. Make them something that they're not. Use them for something that is different. So, what's the covenant? What was the first commandment given to Adam and Chava, to Adam and Eve? Be fruitful and multiply. We see in culture after culture after culture throughout world history that those cultures that are the reigning government is pagan and anti-God, they are not for children. Children can be sacrificed. Children can be done away with. Isn't it interesting in our text, and I think, this struck me years ago, even when I was working on this back in seminary. Who are the ones who put their life at stake in order to save the children? It's the midwives. It's the professional, it's the caregivers. It's the medical people. And what's happened in our culture? Now, I'm not saying across the board, but the medical people are willing to involve themselves and to give their services for abortions. According to the latest statistics that I could find, and I know my father reminded me several times that exaggerations and statistics are the skin of the truth stuffed with a lie. So, you have to be real careful with statistics. It depends how they ask the questions and how they gather it and so forth. But I tried to look at numbers of different statistics, and in general, at least, it is agreed upon that in 2018 there were over 1 million abortions that were performed in the United States of America. So it is the healthcare professionals that are the heroes. The midwives are the first major heroes in the story, but they are so because of their focus. Indeed, the Hebrew text sets this up nicely in the narrative by a possible play on the word see and fear. In chapter 1, verse 16 of our Parashah, Pharaoh proclaims to the midwives, when you are helping the Hebrew women to give birth and see them upon the birth stool, if it is a son, then you shall put him to death. But if it is a daughter, then she shall live. The very next phrase, but the midwives feared God. In Hebrew, the word see, ra'ah, and the word fear, yara, often look alike in their various forms. Indeed, the MT writes the word fear here without the normal final hey, so that it looks even more like the word to see. The point is this: a great deal rests upon our focus, what we look at. Whom do we fear? Pharaoh wanted the midwives to concentrate upon the birth itself. In contrast, the midwives focused upon God. It is interesting to me to note historically how often God has used women to effect significant revivals and spiritual awakenings, as well as to maintain morality and stability within his people. This is why marriage is one of God's institutions, and why we see it in our culture. Once again, we see it eroding, and being no longer, across the board, I should say, no longer given the value that we find in the Scriptures. Throughout the history of Israel, women played a significant, even if at times somewhat unapplauded, role in both the physical as well as the spiritual maintenance of the nation. The same has been true in our own country. And one can point to pivotal events in the life of God's people in which women have played the key roles. It is not surprising then that in the Torah movement of our day, the women are often ahead of the men in pursuing God with a willingness to obey the Torah and teach their children to do the same. At least this has been my experience. As I've traveled around, I've seen, women saying, yes, I've been part of this community for X amount of time. I'm hoping my husband will come, that kind of thing. Now, I'm not putting anybody down here, okay? I'm just saying, in fact, what I'm trying to do is encourage you women. You women have a strategic role in God's kingdom, as we all do, men and women alike. But don't think that your role is in any way less than the role of men. Now, God has given certain offices to men and so forth and so on within the ecclesia, within the community. We may have differing roles, but our importance is equal. And I have, throughout the years here at Beit, I have always appreciated all of you women and the women that have been with us who have made a significant increase in our approach and understanding of who God is. And so we see it here in our text too. Now I want to end our discussion on this text. It strikes me because in the Hebrew, very often in narrative, which is what we have, right? Narrative is telling a story. Very often you will have a subject, okay, like the word God, and then you'll have verbs after that. But you only have the subject once. You'll say, it will say, for instance, just as a for instance, and God spoke, and He made, and He created, and He said, it is good. What we have in our text is the word God is repeated every time before the verb. I think when the Hebrew does that, it's saying, wake up. Think about this. This is different. So, I'm at the top of page 5. Chapter 2, 24 and 25 contain 4 verbs that highlight God's activity at the beginning of our story. But the Hebrew is very interesting in its emphasis upon these 4 verbs because it adds Elohim to each of the verbs where we might normally expect it only at the beginning of the phrases. It says God heard, God remembered, God saw, and God knew. The word heard, we're used to that word, aren't we? Why are we so used to it? What do we say all the time? Shema, Israel. What does it mean? Hear, O Israel. Does it just, maybe you grew up, some of you older, maybe all of us, I don't know, grew up, my father or my mother would tell me to do something, and if I didn't immediately drop what I was doing and turn around and start doing what they said I was supposed to do, oftentimes they would say, usually, Timothy, not Tim, Timothy, did you hear me? In the Hebrew, to hear, in some cases, means to obey. When you hear, you're to do what is heard. So, we're used to it. We have become well aware of the fact that the Hebrew idiom to hear the voice, Shema B'Kol, means to obey. You know that there's no Hebrew word that by itself means to obey? At least that I know of. When it says, and they obeyed, the old King James would say, and they obeyed the voice of the Lord. But it literally is to hear the voice. It means to obey. When we therefore see the verb hear applied to God, it arrests our attention. What does it mean that God heard their groaning? It means much more than merely paying attention. It means first that God is attentive to the needs of His people. So this is what Bill was, we all have, we empathize with what Bill was saying earlier. We've prayed and prayed and prayed and said, Lord. And the psalmist does the same thing. He says, I cry out to you and you don't hear me. Now, did the psalmist really believe he didn't hear him? No. But he says it feels that way. It means first that God is attentive to the needs of His people. How often it is easy to presume that somehow our cares and troubles are so insignificant when compared to God's greatness that He cannot be bothered with them. But the fact is that He is always attentive to the needs of His people. He is fully aware of our groanings and our calling out to him. In fact, one of the often repeated motifs throughout the Psalms is the cry-answer motif. And you'll see this very often in the Psalms. I cried unto the Lord, and he heard me, or he answered me. When the weak cry out to God, he answers them. Now, not always the way the weak think. And maybe not always as soon as you wish. In fact, when it comes to us as though he's not answering, that may well be an answer. When the psalmist cries to God for help, he answers him. Granted, the answers are not always what is expected, but they are always what is best. So do not be afraid to call out to God, to express to him the deepest cares and woes of your soul. He does hear. We learn that from this verse. He remembered. And you say, well, Tim, maybe he had a special relationship with Israel and not with me. Okay, I can understand what you're saying there. There's a national relationship. Are you in covenant relationship with him? Yes, you are. He has made a covenant with you based upon the blood of his own Son. We are covenant members with him. And what is more, Paul emphasizes that when he says we have been grafted in to a covenant, a promise that God has made. So, in the same way that he heard the groanings of the Israelites with whom he had made covenant, so he hears us. And I love to remind myself time and time again where the writer of the Hebrews says that Yeshua always lives to make intercession for us. We have a high priest who goes to the Father on our behalf. The next verse, God remembered. He remembered the promises, the covenant he made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God is a covenant-keeping God, and he never goes back on any of his promises. This you can count on. More often than not, when we have become despondent or are becoming weaker and weaker in our faith, it is because we have failed to focus on and rehearse the promises of God. Don't be afraid to rehearse the promises. Say, Lord, this morning I want to go over some of the promises that come to my mind that you've made to me. I am with you. I will not forsake you. You are mine. You could just go on and on with the promises of God. By focusing on the promises, emphasize them. All too often the people of God languish in weak faith because they are not aware of God's promise. They have never studied and understood the rich promises of the Scriptures. When you're reading your Bible and there's a promise made to you, circle it. Underline it. Put it on a, you can put it on your computer. Make a list so you can go over them. Then you can find books that are already written on this. All the promises of God, Not every one of them is necessarily for each of us, but you understand what I'm saying. Make it personal. Secondly, we often fail to rehearse his promises. Musicians know that rehearsals are important. And if one intends to perform to close perfection, then rehearsals are essential. It is not the purpose of rehearsals to learn the instrument. This must be done in advance. You see the analogy? We have come to faith in the Messiah. We don't have to keep doing that. We don't have to keep saying, okay, I believe in you, I believe in you. No. Now strengthen your faith. Just as you play the instrument. Learn to play it well. Learn to play more than you did last time. And what I learned in my music lessons, the things that seem to be the most boring are the most important. My teacher, Mr. Moody, when I was in high school, he would say, Tim, you're doing very well. We're going to learn all of the scales in all the keys, 2 octaves. Okay. When I'd come to his little room once a week, and we'd get the horn out, he'd always have his horn warmed up, and he'd say, okay, C sharp, 2 scales, or two octaves, up and down. I knew that I was going to hit that every time I went to a lesson. You know what I practiced during the week? Yeah. So if you know that we're going to face difficulties, if we know that we're going to face troubles, don't wait for the troubles to come before you start practicing. Say, how would I face this? How would my faith deal with this as I wait upon the Lord? And when you read the scriptures, it's great, because you can put yourself in Job, like, say, oh boy, if I were Job, what would I do here? You can put yourself in the place of Joseph. You can put yourself in the place of David. You can put yourself in the place of Yeshua. Here he is walking, the most perfect and holy person, individual that's ever walked on this earth. And they're mocking him. They're eventually crucifying him. You say, how would I fare in that? Or Paul. They drag him out, they stone him, think he's dead, leave him on the outside of the city. He's not dead. He gets up and goes to the next city.
Or back into the same one.
Or back into the same one. All right, you get the point. Rehearsals rather have as their goal the owning of the music by the musician. Rehearsals take the notes from the page and make them the possession of the musician. And Mr. Moody would say to me, Tim, you've got the notes down very well. Now let's see if we can make it music. Right? I mean, it's more than just playing the notes. It's making them your own. It's more than just memorizing the scripture. It's memorizing and saying, it's for me. How many times do you wake up in the morning and a verse is going through your head? That's the Lord getting you ready for what you're going to face that day. Yeah, a little schmaltz, yeah. Okay, so rehearse the promises. You'll be ready when the teacher says play the scale. Then we say God saw. Nothing is more evident in this verb than God's ongoing, careful, and kind providence for his people. God saw the children of Israel. This means that he was engaged in their lives, attentive to their needs and their future. He had a plan for them, a plan he intended to accomplish. The same is true regarding all of his children. The Father's eye is upon us. He has plans for good and for blessing, and we must trust him for that. And then the fourth one, God knew. This final activity of God in response to his chosen ones is, of course, the goal to which the others move. Intimate relationship with those he redeems. He knows you, and you and I are becoming better at knowing him. In the course of our studies and lives, in the day-to-day outworking of our various tasks and efforts, it's easy to forget that the ultimate goal of the ages is that God should have close and enduring communion with his people. God wants that with each of us, but he draws us by the welcoming fragrance of his love and the delights of his smile. May we find in him the companion who defines the essence of friendship at every level. This is setting the whole stage for the book of Exodus, because it's about redemption. Why did God allow? Wouldn't you put your feet in the sandals of some of the Israelites? He blessed Joseph like crazy, right? Put him up, had all kinds of power, wealth, whatever. Then Joseph is gone, and what happens? Man. Yeah. It could, why couldn't it have been 2 months rather than 400 years? Right. But why? When we ask that question, and, I've been pondering this question recently. I think many of us have. We ask the question, why? Why? That's longer than the United States has been a nation, right? But, let us not confuse when we come into hard times because of our sin. Okay? What we're talking about here is, was Israel sinful? Yes. Apparently they did. They went into idolatry. We know that as soon as they come out of Egypt, they returned. They said, let us go back to Egypt. At least we have food there. But even when our life is not, when we haven't fallen into disobedience, there can be times of great struggle that God brings upon us. And my mind, I was meditating this week, and I handed you some notes. I'm not going to go through it all, but this kept going over in my head. This is one of the things that happens when you memorize Scripture, right? Have you ever had a song in your head and it goes over and over and over again? There's been times when I've asked the Lord, please take that song out of my head and give me a different one. I'm tired of this one. It's got good words and everything, but there's got to be more than one song in the world. This verse was going through my head all week. Consider it all joy, my brethren, when you encounter various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance. James is not teaching us here that we should never have sorrow or a time of mourning as we experience trials in this fallen world. Nor is he telling us the other thing, that the more you sorrow, the more you mourn, the holier you are. That's not what he's telling us. He's telling us that these difficult times, these difficult sorrows, are meant for our good. It's hard to, in my opinion, it's hard to give a good English equivalent to the word that's translated joy. It's the word charan, which is related to charis, which means grace. Count it all grace? Count it all graciousness? So wait a minute. Does it mean? Recognize that in the difficult times, God is expressing His grace to you because He's making you what you wouldn't be otherwise, and He's giving you the ability to walk through it. That's how I think we should understand this verse. What he's teaching us is this, that we by faith must give ourselves to that which we know to be true, namely, that God is sovereign and in control of all things. Do we really honestly believe that God... Now, I'm giving my translation here, but I think the NSB has it similarly, if not exactly. Romans 8:28. For we know, do we? Do we know? For we know that God causes all things to work together for good to those who love God and are called according to His purpose. Do we really believe that? Sometimes it's kind of hard, isn't it? To say, this isn't right. This is wrong. This shouldn't happen. In a fallen world, there's all kinds of things that happen. And it affects many people. But we cannot go to the conclusion that God cannot control it, that the universe is out of control. No. He's bringing all things to conclude as He intends. And He's teaching us this, that based upon what we know to be true, we affirm that because God is in control of all things, even in those trials we must endure, by His grace and the strength He gives, we will grow stronger in our faith, and thus, in even greater ways, to be trophies of His love and the strength He gives. What is one of the sure marks of true salvation? It is perseverance. John tells us they went out from us, speaking of the unbelievers, because they were not of us. Had they been of us, they would have remained with us, but they went out from us. Now, I'm not talking about just leaving the congregation and going somewhere else. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about turning one's back on the Lord and denying Him and leaving a believing community as a result. See, I'm not there anymore. That's not me. Perseverance. The one who truly is born from above perseveres. How? Because those who are born from above are stronger themselves. They're strong in Him. And they rely upon His strength. So, we affirm that God is in control of all things, even in those trials we must endure. By His grace and the strength He gives, we will grow stronger in our faith, and thus, in even greater ways, to be trophies of His love and strength He gives. What is the ultimate purpose? Westminster Confession had it right? What is the chief end of man? To glorify God and to enjoy Him forever. Sometimes we can glorify God in the midst of trials in a greater way than we could any other way. So, when He tells us to run uphill, He gives us the strength to do it. And people say, wow, that person must have a source of power I don't know about.
Yeah.
Right? You say, well, why couldn't He just make it easy? Ours is not to question why. Ours is to believe and to trust and to obey. It is the knowledge that we can be examples of His power and grace that gives us joy even in the midst of trials. And then verse 4, I'll just close with this. And let endurance have its perfect result, so that you may be perfect and complete. That means mature and complete, lacking in nothing. God is molding us to be more and more like His Son. And sometimes that requires fire. Sometimes it requires surgery. But it always is with His love, and always with His sustenance, and always with His promise, I will never leave you. I will never forsake you. We can count on Him.